Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final episode of our season for the Best Fleets to Drive For podcast. I'm Mark Morrell, co-creator of the Best Fleets to Drive For program, joined by my trusty sidekick, Trish Bethel, Best Fleets program manager. And today, our guest is Andrew Erin, Vice President of Technology Advancement at PGT. So, welcome, Andrew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to get to talk to you guys a little bit about what PGT is up to.
All right. Well, let's start by giving a little bit of an overview of the company, what you do, where you're located, all of that kind of stuff.
Sure. We are in a flatbed trucking company based out of Pittsburgh, PA, a little outside of Pittsburgh, a town called Hopewell, Pennsylvania. We've been in business for 42 years. We were founded by a guy named Pat Gallagher, who's still the CEO and still very involved in the business. And so historically, we're based in Pittsburgh, but we have terminals across the country. We're especially strong in the industrial Midwest. So if you can kind of imagine Chicago headed east through Pittsburgh to the East Coast, north and south along the East Coast, down the Mississippi River. We have a big presence in Laredo, Texas, where we'll take freight from the United States, and then it crosses into Mexico and delivers on one of our trailers, care of a Mexican partner carrier. And we're working on expansion into the West. So we've got a fledgling terminal in Arizona that's been running for about 2 years, working on getting that fully operational with its own network. So we are growing, but our strength is primarily flatbed. So that means for us, a lot of metals. We're about 60% metals. Most of that's steel, also some aluminum, and we'll do a lot of building products as well. That's the core business. And when I say PGT Trucking, I'm describing the flatbed business. Really, properly speaking, we have some sister companies as well that handle some interesting stuff, one of which is probably notable, called Southern Pines Trucking. They have two divisions. One does open deck specialized, so high, wide, and heavy stuff, and some really interesting loads that are like well beyond a guy like mine's pay grade. They're hauling rockets and other wild things, like super load stuff. That's one of the divisions. The other Southern Pines division does cryogenic tanker. So they're hauling liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen, a little bit of hydrogen, LNG, stuff like that. So a pretty diverse company. We'll haul a lot of stuff. We even got a little van division. So as long as it's safe and makes drivers money and makes PGT money, we're willing to look at it and do it. But our core competency is flatbed and cryogenic tankers.
Wow, that is very diversified. I didn't realize that. Yeah. And how many trucks are you guys operating right now?
Between all of them put together, around 1,000 with the sister company.
And I introduce you as the Vice President of Technology Advancement, and I love that title. It's not one that I see all the time in trucking. So tell us a little bit about what your role is there.
Sure. So it's a little bit wide-ranging. At its core, part of the problem is the software we use inside the office. We're working on developing somewhat of a homegrown TMS. In our world, TMS is a trucking company's ERP. Our evaluation was the off-the-shelf products wouldn't meet a company like ours needs. And if you look at the really large carriers, you see they have a pretty highly customized instance of whatever they're running, and that's our scenario as well. But our legacy system is eventually going to have to be sunsetted because of its technological limitations. Based on the code it's written on. So I in part lead a team of people working on creating a more modern TMS. To put it really simply, I don't want to go too far down this road because I don't think too many people would be interested in it, but it's a little more complex than that. It's more an amalgamation of tightly integrated connections. But that's part of it. Part of it is We think we need better systems to support our customers, better systems to support our drivers and their experiences. And that applies not only to the kind of computers that people like me type on every day in an office, but how our drivers interact with technology is another good example of that. So another thing that falls under my purview is drivers technology. And a big driver, a big thing motivating how I spend my time is something we're doing going to, how would impact the driver's work experience, right? So one thing we do, a little diversion, new staff always goes on ride-alongs with drivers. So I started about 10 years ago at PGT. So that was 10 years ago, but I still very distinctly remember the experience. I won't name the vendor, but we had a very well-known vendor as an ELD in the truck 10 years ago. And I'm holding the tablet with a driver and he's driving and he's telling me, hey, do this thing that's going to communicate to the office that we just picked this load up. And I'm using it. And again, this is 10 years ago. I think we may take for granted how much better things like smartphones have gotten in 10 years. But even then, 10 years ago, I thought this is almost insulting in terms of how bad this technology is, truly. Mm-hmm. And I actually got a little bit angry because I'm like, we're asking these drivers to do like a lot of stuff. Not only navigate a very large vehicle that weighs a lot through traffic, which is increasingly challenging with the way the rest of us drive, but also like flatbedding is especially hard, right? Because these drivers have to secure their loads down to the trailer. And if you don't do that right, that's a big problem. So they have all these huge responsibilities. And then I'm giving them a piece of technology that's just insulting to them in that it asks them to like enter the date 6 times. Like the tablet knows the date, right? Like why? Mm-hmm. So that was a formative experience for me because I thought, no one had really considered like, hey, what's the user experience going to be like for this driver whenever he's holding this thing? And like, how does that, thinking selfishly as a manager in the company, like how does that drive things like retention, right? Or if he's frustrated every day, every time he picks up that tablet, like that doesn't help me, and also probably doesn't help safety, right? If I got a frustrated driver, and it's just we could do better. Like we all, especially increasingly, I keep glancing at my phone over here. Like we've all come to expect a lot better. Mm-hmm. So one thing, that's a long diversion, but apologies. But one thing I'm doing is trying to reshape our driver-facing technology to be organized the same way we would all expect a product. If you go and buy a new iPhone or a new Android phone, like it's going to work well. And like, not only is it going to work well, but like, no Apple employee has to train you in how to use the new app. You just pick it up and it's intuitive and it works well. And maybe they added a new feature last week that you didn't think of, but now that you use it, like, oh, that's a great idea. And it's kind of obvious. And so we're working on, first of all, we're changing our ELD. We have a highly customized workflow that's more tightly integrated with our TMS, and that is designed first and foremost around the driver's experience to make it as simple as possible and as easy as possible for them to communicate what's going on and support them throughout their job, because as we know, their job's really hard. So my work in part surrounds trying to help drivers more with technology. And then broadly speaking, PGT is somewhat of an early adopter on some stuff, including zero emission tractors, both battery electric and hopefully soon hydrogen fuel cell electric tractors, as well as experimenting with autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles and understanding how that would integrate into our business model. And I help work on those projects and have for the last couple of years. So it's a wide kind of ranging and not entirely well-defined role that I'm in. I've also only been in it for 7 months, so just figuring it out as we go, to be totally frank.
Geez, I'd hate to see your description if you've been in it for 5 years. But that is a fabulous introduction that tees up the next several questions, which were all things that I think we were going to ask you later. But since you've touched on them now, I want to get started on those. And the first one is talking about that technology integration. That was one of the things that stood out for me early on with PGT, and how much you're doing for drivers to make their workflow more efficient and less frustrating, as you say. But talk to us a little bit about how you include drivers in that process of selecting the technology, piloting it, sort of getting their feedback so that you're doing the right things for them.
So that's a great question. I've done a lot of roles at PGT. spent 6 of my 10 years working in operations, meaning working with drivers, right? Most of the time as a driver manager or as a terminal manager. And I had the great privilege of working with some of our like million mile safe drivers who've been here 10, 20, 30 years, right? And the kind of two sides of that coin. The great thing and the sometimes somewhat annoying thing about drivers who've been around that long is like they got great feedback for you, right? And they're never shy for the most part, and that's good, right? Because it keeps like I don't have a CDL, right? I've never driven a truck, so it helps keep someone like me honest, which I probably need, right, to get that feedback from them. So very early in my career, a driver who since passed away 2 years ago, but with whom I became eventually very close, he would constantly beat on me about a speccing decision of a tractor. So we had bought 2013 International trucks and we eliminated a cabinet. I don't know why. I don't know who made the decision. But we eliminated a cabinet in these trucks, right? And he talked to me about that cabinet for years. Look, here's the thing, and here's why I remember it and why I'm bringing it up. Because it's like he was right, like I don't know who made the decision, but like whoever it was probably hadn't sat in the truck or like tried to think about like how am I going to store healthy meals or like clothes or like what's the accessibility to laundry facilities on our typical routes. And Cuz, who's this driver's name, like he did like that was his job and that was his life. And his feedback to me was always like, you need to listen to the drivers. And I think about that a lot. And as I said, as someone who has found himself in a position to make changes in the company, but who also has never driven an over-the-road truck as his job, I'm very aware of that as a reminder to keep myself humble about what I know and maybe more accurately what I very much don't know, which is the empathetic experience of living that life. So we try to involve, that's all background. We try to involve drivers to the greatest extent we can. So specifically with the ELD selection, that started with sampling drivers. Hey, what's your experience like? Surveying them formally. What don't you like? What do you like? And that evolved into, we did down selection with vendors. We landed on 2 that we thought would be able to successfully create the type of driver-centric workflow that I described. We had them do that. Then we had first small and then quite large pilot fleets. And we made our decision primarily based on the drivers. So if you ask me who picked our ELD vendor, I could tell you there was a committee. The reality is we made the decision ultimately because they could create a driver-centric workflow. And then I put it in front of drivers and drivers told us that was right. So I'm not here to say it's perfect. So we're still working on it. In fact, every day we're working on making these experiences better, but we made that decision primarily based on what the drivers preferred. And then we figured out the back end of things to make that work for guys like me, right? Because it's harder to replace drivers than me. So that's why we made this decision. So we try to make them as driver-centric as we can with involvement as appropriate. So in the case of ELD, that was sampling them. In the case of truck specs, that's a little different kind of conversations we have with the kind of drivers we trust. But we do our best to try to incorporate their feedback, knowing that it's really important and it doesn't take a little bit of those kind of questions for them to feel really valued and for us to learn a little bit more about what it's like to have done that job.
Yeah, nice. So one of the other things that's always really important to drivers, and you alluded to this when you're talking about your background, is that the relationship with the fleet manager or dispatch, depending on the company. And you've got a very well-refined process that you use for pairing drivers with fleet managers and sort of have different categories of things that you consider when you're figuring out the best fit. So you talk a little bit about that, how you make sure that the drivers are working with the right people and how you manage that to keep people happy?
Sure. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I'll present something to you that might appear sciencey, but I'll tell you there's a lot of art involved in it too. But it's one of the most unique things that I would expect that's unique that we do is we use personality assessments on all staff and all drivers. And we use those personality assessments for a variety of things, including and especially finding, understanding the best ways to manage them, right? So I know a lot about me, so I could tell you about me. Like the personality assessment would tell you certain things that you need to give me certain amounts of freedom. Here's how feedback would be. I would take it best so you can get the most out of me. Here's what type of things would make me feel micromanaged. Here's the type of if given a personality of a particular manager and my personality, here's where we might have cautions in our relationship. Here's where another area where maybe our relationship would be a strength. And we use that not only for me and my boss and people who report to me, but also with drivers. And we found that to be pretty helpful to help, because like we're all people, right? And that's all this is, finding ways to treat people decently and understand what they need and communicate more effectively. And that's like, it sounds simple, but it's actually really hard, I found, at least for me. So we use a personality tool that helps us, first of all, better match managers and drivers, or we call fleet managers and drivers, really people in the office. And then also that tool, because no one's like, we're not here like matchmaking relationships. Like I could tell you who you ought to marry, right? Based on this tool. It more tells you, hey, here's what you ought to watch out for. Like, for instance, it would tell you that I'm particularly impatient, which is true. And turns out, actually, we've studied what's like the personality profile look like of a 1,000,000-mile safe driver. And it's probably not entirely surprising for me to tell you that, as a rule of thumb, safe drivers tend to be actually pretty patient people, right? They're not tailgating like maybe I would be, right? Or like honking, or get out of the left lane, which I'm not saying I would do, but maybe I've done it before. So here you've got an impatient person in the office who's trying to drive things, like cover more loads, right? That sounds probably pretty familiar for a lot of trucking operations, but it turns out our best drivers are, as a rule of thumb, patient, right? So you can't pair up, ultimately we want patient drivers, and ultimately people in the office might need to have a sense of urgency, like, hey, we need to get things done so we can get drivers home and make them money, right? So you can't necessarily find a way to make those two things the same, but it does help to know that, especially when you're hiring, a lot of fleet managers, they're not all 30-year experienced fleet managers who are driver whisperers. Some of these are kids who are 22 and out of college, right? And they need to learn how to manage people, right? And that's not easy. And I don't think they teach it very well in school. So a lot of this work is actually, it's partly matching drivers and staff, but it's also training staff on like, hey, here's how you ought to understand. You might intend for something to come across one way, right? Your intent might be this, but your impact might be very different, right? Whenever I'm always struck by the stark difference between a fleet manager's life in the office in terms of its pace and the driver's pace, right? Because like I used to track this. I know that when I was a fleet manager, I got an average of over 100 inbound phone calls per day. And I could tell you at PGT, we do a lot of things well. One thing I don't think we do great is like we have too many emails. So I might get 1,000 emails a day. Got 100 phone calls and 1,000 emails plus phone calls I'm dialing out. So I'm like, busy. And then I've got a 30-second interaction with a driver. He might have like 5 contacts with a human being that day. And then I'm having like overwhelming, like insane, no way you could do them all well level of interaction. So you have this extreme differential in experiences, right? So if that person in the office is callous or cavalier, or like maybe even put more accurately, is not very intentional with the way he or she communicates with that driver, like there's going to be a mismatch between intent on what they're saying and the impact of what they're saying. So this personality testing we do helps people in the office become more cognizant of the way they communicate, and the way that it might impact an individual driver, because everyone is different. And so we've tried to adapt our coaching, our management, whatever the case may be, or our communication to everybody. So we are better managers, we're better communicators, so that, we're not accidentally upsetting someone when we don't mean to. It's just that, okay, we're juggling a lot of phone calls, like that example, or we're just different people. So you asked how we match drivers. Personality is a big part of that, but I'd say the personality testing we do is a lot more valuable than just matching. It's really about learning how to become better communicators, better managers of peers and staff and superiors.
You just said something there that I think is really important for people to kind of be aware of. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of fleet executives kind of inherently get or subconsciously understand, but they're not really thinking about it in a conscious way. And that's your point about the best drivers being very patient, kind of low-key type people, which makes perfect sense for them to be able to survive what they need to do. But the operations people being the exact opposite of that. And they need to keep things moving. And you don't want to change either of those. You want both of those people doing exactly that, but they need to figure out how to balance. They each need to understand that the other is the way they are and why that's important. The operations person needs to understand why it's important for that driver to be low key and quiet and patient and all of that stuff. And the driver needs to understand why it's important for ops to be high energy and impatient and always moving. But they also need to understand how to work together. So yeah, having that stuff sort of spelled out and said, okay, these people are like this. This is why it's better for the business. And here's how to interact. Here are the ways that you can interact with that person. That must avoid a ton of miscommunication and really help you deal with a lot of that inherent conflict that comes up when you have such different personality types.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, you said it better than I did. Like, it's absolutely, it's incredibly impactful. I'll give you another example besides patience. You may like I work with some folks who are incredibly intelligent, computer programmers, for example, right? That work for me, way smarter than me. They can do things I can't do, many things I can't do. But some of them, like if I ask them a question like, hey, what's going on with this project? It's like I've stumped them, right? And it's not that they don't like know the answer, but it's that if I understood their personality, and I strive to do this, if I understood their personality, I wouldn't like pop quiz them in passing when they're the kind of person who, even if they're like 15 feet away from me, I'm going to send them an email. And I know that sounds stupid. But I'm going to send them an email because that person actually just needs like 2 minutes to compose his thoughts. And then he's going to actually give me a fantastic answer, maybe better than somebody else, maybe better than the answer I might give, but he's just not comfortable speaking extemporaneously, right? Because his drives are for an incredible attention to detail, which probably makes him a great computer programmer and means that he has a high regard for the rules. Another thing we found is really important for good truck drivers. They like formality. They do things the same way every time. They respect the right way of doing things, right? They're not cavalier with rules like that. But that same type of person probably doesn't actually handle like a quiz or like being pushed in that same way. They might actually prefer having a prompt that gives them a little bit of time to respond, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of having to do it verbally. And so, for instance, which we've played with lots of different ways of doing this, say you have like a driver, driver feedback board or some variation of that. And we've done it probably every different way you could do it. Here's one of my concerns, right? You get the people who are comfortable doing that. You end up with like this outlier group of drivers. Sometimes they're the super externally, like they're great, love to talk. That's not all of them, right? And while those people might well express other people's concerns, well, they also might not. And so if you limit your driver feedback groups to just like, hey, let's get the guys who we know like to talk, and the guy like I mentioned earlier, Cuz, who's always had his feedback for me, you're also not necessarily capturing all the experiences of drivers, and you're actually probably excluding a large group. In my case, that's what I found: a large group of drivers who have a high regard for detail, and so therefore do things the right way, something I value a lot, but don't want to be quizzed by, the CEO of the company, who is probably pretty intimidating for a lot of people to talk to, right? So they shy away from that experience. And so one thing we strive to do is give them opportunities for that feedback where they can communicate with us in ways that aren't necessarily so like high pressure or intense, and allow us to still learn from those types of drivers instead of actually thinking we're hearing from the whole fleet, but you're actually hearing from a weird subset of the group, right? And that's an insight that we figured out because of personality, because we realized these people that we were talking to all the time, it's always the same kind of person. Maybe that person not entirely representative of the whole fleet, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
On that note, you've got several different driver advisory boards. So how do you choose who's going to be on them? Do you try to get a cross section of all those different groups of drivers that you have, or do you rotate them on and off? Or
yeah, there's a lot of dynamism in that group, because in past iterations of it got stagnant in part because I thought, like, this is somewhat what I was trying to speak to earlier. We were getting the similar feedback from similar people, and not that we weren't addressing it, but it was like you're getting the same type of drivers, right? And so I'll tell you, I'm not certain that we've figured out what driver advisory boards ought to look like entirely, because we've never settled on what we've done with them. I'm very confident that we need lots of driver feedback, and I think I've tried to argue that successfully here today, because I think the most successful things we do are largely successful because we've thought a lot and gotten a lot of driver feedback during the process of that, right? But we've changed our driver advisory boards quite a bit, in part because we want to make sure we're getting different voices on them, right? Like the driver keeps coming back to, cuz like, he was a great guy, easy to like, easy to get along with, love to talk. He's a shoo-in, right? You asked me, hey, we have to get a driver advisory board meeting together, get me some drivers who are definitely willing to come. Like, everyone in my seat would have a list, right? And that list is probably guys who all, for the most part, they're guys, right? Drivers who all pretty much, like, they all kind of, it's the same type of guy. And so we're trying to be intentional and not somewhat reactionary with the way we create those compositions of drivers. So I'll give you an example. Most recent one we did, we made it very intentional to ensure we actually had several different ones, right? We had one ways we split them up was very veteran drivers, and then we intentionally sought drivers who had been here less than, I think it was 180 days, but more than 40 is, I think, where we drew the line, to get their feedback, right? And that was driven in part by looking at your turnover numbers and realizing, hey, we thought we could do better in this early time. And part also because we realized this bias that we had, like, we only asked 20-year veterans, they don't know anything about, like, the for instance, we're doing a lot to try to retain these newer drivers, right? So we have programs to try to help them. But, like, if I ask about the mentorship program, from the guys who've been here 10 years, I'm only going to hear from mentors, right? And that's self-evident. But that, if you only talk to the experienced guys, you're going to have that same kind of bias. So we've tried to split our driving fleet up in a lot of different ways to try to get a lot of different voices and try to understand, hey, what's actionable, and what might be speaking more broadly across the fleet, for the types of experiences our drivers have, and how can we ameliorate them. So,
Fantastic.
maybe I ought to listen to the rest of your podcast, because I'm still trying to figure out exactly what one of these the best driver advisory board can look like. I tell you, we are very actively experimenting because we want to understand, and I don't think we're quite settled on what they look like. The one thing I will tell you that I do feel good about is when we have these experiences, and we just did one of these in Baltimore this spring, we've gotten a lot better with follow-up on them, right? Like, because you have this temptation, like, let's all meet, like, oh, good job, we talked to the drivers, we are driver centric, and then we pat ourselves on the back and, like, go back to our air conditioned office and then don't do anything. And that is like, I think that the temptation might be the wrong word, but the proclivity to end up having done that is there. And it's, like, kind of disgusting to have given yourself credit for doing something and then not done anything at all. So we've gotten a lot better at follow-up. So for instance, in this Baltimore one we did, this was just a very large fleet. This fleet is somewhat unique, a lot more IC than company guys. So it's composition's a little bit unusual within the company. And so we thought it was best to kind of sample that. And we had very strong follow-up. So we, this is C-level executives running this, of like, hey, here is the takeaways. We have these 8 things, and here's who is assigned to address them. And then here are the drivers with whom we are following up after we've addressed it to, share them with, hey, here's what we've done. And then we want you to follow back up with us to tell us, hey, did we actually address what you were saying, or did we miss the mark, or did we not hear you right, or, is whatever. And that's the one thing I'm saying I'm very confident in, besides diversity of the slices of the driving fleet that you're looking at, is, like, follow-up has to be really there. And if it's not, then you're just, like, trying to make yourself feel better, and then you're not going to do anything. And that's where I hear that driver in my ear about, like, listening to the drivers. Like, you have to have that, and you have to follow up with them, or you're actually just going to lose credibility, because when they go to the second one and they're saying the same thing, like, hey, we still have this issue and you guys aren't addressing it, then you're probably worse off than if you had never tried to listen to them in the first place.
Well, I can tell you, we see that over and over again with best fleets. As we see companies getting into that top 20, they've learned that they need to gather the information, but they need to deliver and provide feedback, good or bad, but keep drivers informed. That's the step that so many companies miss, but that's what makes you so successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say we're still learning on this, but we're trying to get better. I am proud of some of the stuff we've done on this. I think we're making
Excellent. Well, you had quite a fair number of returns, drivers that had left the company and come back. So do you attribute that to how you've changed things?
That's
Or
hard to say. I mean, yeah, rehires are a huge component of our, if you call it recruiting, of our hiring base. That's absolutely true. I think there is a grass is greener aspect to that across the trucking industry, right? And we don't do sign-on bonuses, but I know other, our competitors do, right? And they're marketed as here's a shocking amount of money, but in reality, it's not really a sign-on bonus because it's prorated over extreme amount of time. We don't deal with that because it's not incentivizing the type of thing we want to incentivize. And it's dishonest, is my view, in our view. And I think those things might be pulling people away. And then when they realize, hey, I was sold something that's somewhat dishonest or not the full picture, they end up realizing, hey, you know what, that wasn't so bad. Rehires are absolutely a big part of what we do, and we're proud of that. But we'd rather them not have left in the first place. So I have very much have two minds on it, because I'm glad they came back, but I'm also trying to figure out, like, what did we do wrong early? What did we not communicate effectively? Did we not give them the right venues for airing frustrations, or pathways for escalations where they thought, hey, the way to resolve my problems is to leave. I'm not satisfied with where we stand on that, to be honest with you. Even though we get a lot of people back, but they shouldn't have left in the first place. It would have been better for them, because changing jobs is not good for drivers in terms of their paychecks, and disrupting their families' lives and everything else. It'd been better for us if they had just stayed here. So we're working very actively to try to better predict driver turnover, using another thing my team's working on, using like machine learning to like churn through all the data that we have and understand, hey, what's any given driver's likely tenure at this point in time. Try to understand, like, hey, where should our efforts lie, right? Like, who should, of course, we have like everybody, we've got people focused on driver retention, but like, to whom should they be talking and about what is a great question, right? Because if you just wait till the guy says he quits and he's already scheduled for orientation at competitor B, then we've already messed up, and our opportunity is gone for the most part to save that particular driver. So we're trying to figure out what is it that's going on earlier, so we can reach out and talk to them. And if it's our fault, maybe we can address something or correct something, or at least let them know, like, hey, we think, there's ups and downs in this business. We think, hey, you had it down, but hey, your last 3 weeks were great. We think the next 3 weeks are going to be great. And then we hang up the phone and then go walk to operations and say, hey, we got to make sure we take care of this guy. And that's a great use of someone's time, rather than after the fact calling them and trying to hire them back. Like, wow, that's been good for us. I'd rather they, just we resolve the problem early. So a lot of our efforts are focused on that aspect. I don't think that's in any way unique. But I do think the way we're going about it is going to be particularly effective, because we have a lot of information and it's hard to parse through it all, if you're a human being, and understand, like, hey, how is home time changing? How is paychecks varying over time? How are, detention changing over time? How's even something like idle time or phone calls into the office? That's all data points any sophisticated trucking company could pull. And we're pulling them and putting them into a model to try to better predict who's frustrated, because they don't always tell you, even when you ask them. And I'm sure you guys know, there's vendors out there that'll sell you their survey services, and we've tried it, and I'm not entirely sure that we always hear the correlation between, hey, who's going to quit and who's not, who's really mad, who doesn't. Because there's plenty of people, like, I'm sure you guys, like Mark, you've probably had a bad experience at a restaurant. Did you go on their website and fill out a survey? Like, not everybody does.
Right.
Like, I do that and my wife thinks I'm a jerk. I do it because I'm like a manager, and I think if I were the manager of that restaurant,
Exactly.
thank you for telling me.
Yes,
But apparently that
exactly.
makes me a jerk in my wife's mind. But like most people don't fill out their surveys, and we found that's somewhat true for us, right? So we want to better seek out what's going on with our driving fleet so we can target communications and address problems early before they leave and lose paychecks and find out that the grass isn't greener.
Nice. Yeah.
Wonderful.
I want to go sort of in a different direction for a minute, back to something that you said sort of right near the beginning, and talk about environmental stuff, because you had mentioned getting involved in that. And I know that's an area where you're doing uh, some things that not a lot of fleets are doing. You experimented with several different things. So talk about some of the things that you're doing on the environmental side, and they're less common.
Yeah, so we are purchased several zero emission tractors. The ones we purchased are battery electric trucks. Okay.
Mm.
So for lack of a better comparison, I think we're all kind of increasingly familiar with battery electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Teslas or similar cars from other people. That's basically one of these things is not Tesla brand, but it's Nikola. You plug it into the grid. It has batteries. It charges those batteries. That gives you the energy to go down the road, right? No diesel engine, no gasoline. Um, those vehicles, we've got a couple on the road now. We've got a letter of intent for 100 fuel cell electric trucks.
Nice.
Fuel cell is a little different in that the energy is stored in hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a fuel cell. It's been a long time since chemistry class for me, but basically the fuel cell takes hydrogen that it carries plus oxygen that gets out of the air, and it produces electricity, and its emission is water vapor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The cool thing we think about hydrogen is that it's very similar to a diesel truck at the end of the day. You fuel them up in about 20 minutes, like you would a diesel truck. And you don't have to like wait for them to charge. And so it fits the kind of the ways PGT, our customers, our drivers are used to operating. Battery is somewhat limited in our view to particular use cases, like maybe drayage is where you see these getting early traction. We don't do drayage, but we do have some short haul dedicated operations where every day you're returning to the same point and you're maybe doing like 4 runs back and forth, right? And that kind of environment, we think a battery electric is actually a fit for us. So yeah, for the last couple of years, I've been talking with our customers and saying, hey, these things are a little bit off in the future. We'd like hydrogen. We think hydrogen's a fit for America's, the way we structure transportation. Got to figure out how to get fuel, obviously. But we're working on these things, and I didn't have any asks for the customers. I said, you're important to us, Mr. Customer, and we think PGT is important to you, so we think you ought to know. And if you have questions, let us know. Now, I'll tell you, behind the scenes, our thinking was this. A lot of our customers are large, many of them publicly traded companies. A lot of these companies have made various, commitments saying, hey, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to reduce our CO2 emissions in our full value chain, meaning not only the emissions they produce, let's say in a steel plant, but like how is their energy that runs that steel plant, how is that produced? What's the emissions involved in that? And then scope 3, where PGT Trucking comes in, is transportation emissions. And we found a lot of our customers are trying to solve this problem of like, how do we make their business, whether that's steel or building products or whatever, how do we make it more sustainable? Because that's what their shareholders are asking for. That's increasingly the view that the regulatory environment's going to force us into, right? So if our customers are asking for that, we thought it behooves us to, if we're going to do it, we may as well be early, right? And so that's what we've done. And so in talking to our customers about hydrogen, we found that many of them were interested and ready to go now, but hydrogen's not ready to go yet, probably a year off for us till we can get the hydrogen infrastructure in the Rust Belt. So we thought, hey, they asked like, hey, a couple of these customers, can you get us a battery electric truck? And so we looked at it and we said, sure. So we're early days on them. I will tell you that we've learned some pretty counterintuitive things. So one thing we thought is that, hey, maybe these will help with drivers because everyone wants young drivers, right? Because eventually drivers who are 65 are eventually going to retire, right? So what if we thought, hey, maybe these new fancy technologically advanced trucks would help us recruit younger drivers. First of all, I'd say that we found that to be true. But what we didn't expect and we found to be very true, is that the driving experience of these trucks is actually very appealing for some of the more seasoned veteran drivers, right? Guys, so I'm thinking of one particular million-mile safe driver who has won our like company driver of the year award recently, and he was on our early, we call future flatbed fleet. Drivers who we trust to give us good feedback. Drivers were safe because these trucks are expensive. We don't want them getting messed up. And he's in his late 50s, and he's been telling me, hey, I'm thinking about retirement. I'm like, Craig, you can't retire. We need you. Don't retire, please. And then he drives the battery electric truck, and he got out and he's like, this thing might keep me around for a little bit because like diesel trucks are, if you've never been in them, they're incredibly loud. They vibrate the heck out of these guys' bodies for 11 hours of driving every day, right? And while we've increasingly gone to these automated manual transmissions, like they're still hard on these people's bodies. And they're not like, they don't accelerate in a way that's thrilling to anybody, right? Jump in an electric truck, okay? And like we have to detune these things so that they don't spin the tires and do burnouts because they have insane amounts of torque, right? And if you've never driven in like an electric car, that may not be intuitive to you, but like electric motors have all the torque available all the time, right? So like these things are incredibly powerful. So you might think, oh, this is some green truck, like you've detuned this thing so it has no power. Like, no, it's not. These trucks are passing people fully loaded going up the hills of Western Pennsylvania. And like, that's a selling point for a driver. Like, it's a selling point for me. Like, I don't want to be going 20 miles an hour in the right lane of an interstate being vibrated back and forth. And we found these trucks are better for drivers, right? Because it's just a better experience. Like, who wants to be rattled to death all day long, especially if you've been there and done that. You've been driving for 20 years. You're kind of over some of the ego of this whole thing, that you're like kind of ready to be treated to a better experience while working. And like, that's what we didn't fully anticipate. We thought it would attract 23-year-olds. Turns out like 63-year-olds might be our best use case for this. Like, if I can extend the driving career of a safe million-mile plus driver by a couple of years, like that's really meaningful for me. And that's one of the things we've learned about these battery electric trucks. So hydrogen's still a little ways off. Hopeful maybe in a year we're going to have fueling stations in the Midwest, and then we can roll those out here. So it is early days, full disclosure, but you got to find the right use case because the trucks are expensive. You got to find the right customer and figure out a way to make the economics make sense. For us, we found it to be a good experience. It's also helped us become a little bit, give you an example where this young person thing is true. Like, talk to young people about what we're doing, trying to hire them out of college, right, to work in the office. That's like an exciting thing to talk about. Like, I'm trying to hire computer programmers, right, to help build a system for me. And trucking may not be like the sexiest business for a kid. We're in Pittsburgh. So kid graduating from Carnegie Mellon University, prestigious computer science education program, right? Like, there's a lot of things those kids can go do. Google's down the road, like I got to try to hire that kid to come work for a flatbed trucking company. Like, well, it turns out actually, if you reach a little bit and willing to take a little bit of risks, this business actually might have quite a few opportunities for embracing modernity and getting a little bit better, whether it's with something cool like an electric truck, or with machine learning, or with just taking a different approach to the same problem. So those are the types of things we try to do. And yeah, I think it'll have benefits once we fully figure out how to operationalize these things on the actual road in our market. I think it'll help with drivers, but I also think these types of things help make us a better company by creating a culture that says like we don't want to be last. Like, I don't want to be mid-pack. If we're going to compete with something, like, we want to be good. Like, we want to be the best. Like, I walked into the president's office one day a couple of years ago, all proud because we had risen our level at a key customer. Mr. Troyan, I'm proud to tell you that we are now number 2 at this customer. And I was thinking, like, I'm going to get a pat on the back, right? And he's like, get out of my office. When Greg Troyan, who's the president, and Pat Gallagher, who's the owner, when Greg and Pat do something, like, we do it to be the best. And like, showed me the door. And like, I'm like, oh, and that like burned in my brain. But like, we want to be early because we think that makes us better, right? Because it creates a standard of excellence And we sure hold drivers to a standard of excellence, so we certainly need to hold ourselves to that. And that type of culture, it has to be pervasive, but when it is pervasive, it helps attract the best kind of people, which is what you need to be competitive, in my view. It's probably going to be easy in 10 years to be a late comer to this, but I think we're going to be better in 10 years because we weren't.
Nice. Well, I think that is a fantastic place to wrap it up. So that is really good insights, really good sense. I think you've really made it clear to everybody why you are a best fleet to drive for. So thanks very much for joining us on the episode today.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk, and appreciate both of your time today.
Thanks, Andrew.